I'm going to be going over Harbor Wall and some of the mechanics behind it. This all kind of came to be when there's a Woohoojin stream doing a pro analysis on a harbor video, um, in which the harbor wall down here, and it came to two different heights depending on where you threw it down there. And so I'll go over that later. Firstly, I want to go over some things that are going to help with analyzing and understanding how the harbor wall works. So the first thing I want to do is differentiate the difference between what I'm calling valid terrain and what is invalid terrain. And so the first thing I'm going to do here is valid terrain is any terrain that harbor wall can interact with. And so if you see here, this harbor wall is very clearly at a height above or at this bench instead of on the ground. And so it was able to climb up onto this bench. That's valid terrain. Most terrain inbounds is going to be valid terrain. Things like this cone don't actually have collision, and so it's not valid terrain. But there are some things out of bounds that are a little bit more weird. For instance, there's this ramp here, which you throw a projectile at it, the projectile can collide with it. But if I were to want the harbor wall to climb this ramp, it doesn't, because it doesn't detect it as valid, what I'm calling valid terrain for the sake of harbor wall. And so this might be collidable terrain, but that does not mean it's valid terrain for harbor wall to interact with. And so that's kind of the brief analysis on terrain here. The other thing I'm going to look at before we get started is the actual structure of the harbor wall. And so, by the way, all this stuff is talked about more in the document. And so if you want to have a better look at some of this stuff, it's all in the document. Their piece is meant to go coincide with each other, but for the sake of this video, I won't be mentioning a lot of numbers or discovering how I got them. So anyway, you can see here that there were 5 segments to that harbor wall. I'll do it again here real quick. Hopefully follow this, get it to stop here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 relatively overlapping segments of harbor wall. And the height of these harbor walls are determined by the center point of each segment. And so if we go over to this ramp here and we throw a wall something like this underneath, you can see this wall is slightly lower, this wall segment. That's because it's slightly on this ramp, and so the center point is slightly onto that ramp, and that's why it's getting that at that height. And so that's kind of the structure of harbor wall. So it's got 5 segments. Each segment's height is determined by the point at the center of the segment at the bottom of the wall. The next thing we're going to do is talk about the starting position of harbor wall. There's a couple things that go into it, but the main idea is that it has a upper threshold, and it will search down to a lower threshold, and the first thing it finds, it will spawn there. So the upper threshold is about 2 meters through my testing. And so what should happen here is we spawn it on top of here, and the wall spawns on top of here. And then if we were to spawn a wall off this ledge, there we go. Wall spawns down here. This is about a 4-meter drop, but from the analysis I've been doing, I'm estimating it to be about a 7-meter drop for it to be valid. And so what it'll do is it'll search 2 meters down to 7 meters, and the tallest thing it finds within that range is going to be what it determines the starting height to be. And this is all in accordance with Harbor's feet, and so it's 2 meters above foot level, which is about head height. It's about head height. So the other thing is, if it can't find anything within those thresholds, let's say we go far out of bounds, it's just going to start at harbor feet level. So if you go here, this is about harbor feet level, and so it defaults to harbor's feet level if it doesn't find any valid terrain to spawn on top of. So the starting thresholds are different than the climbing thresholds. So if we were to say, oh, we want this wall to start here but climb this box, go here and see that it did not climb that box. We can throw another one just to make sure. There we go. It did not climb up this box. doesn't have a starting point there. And so the climbing threshold is less than the starting threshold, and it's about 1 meter. So if we were to do it this way, you can see it climbed down to here, and now this wall is much higher now. So that's that. Now, if we were to look at falling thresholds, falling threshold is something more like this, where how far will the wall drop if it's falling off of a ledge? The answer to that is about 8 meters through my testing. Now, you'll never interact with that steep of a drop in a real map because those drops don't exist. But this drop, for example, is about 4 meters. 2 to 6, that's 4 is the difference. There we go. Now, there is something a bit interesting about falling. If the falling height is more than 2 meters, then it's going to have some interesting interactions. What it basically does, from my understanding, is pre-calculate where the wall is going to be ahead of time. And I will show you what that looks like on my alt account. So if we throw a wall here, watch closely, you can see that for a split second there's actually 2 harbor walls existing at the same time. What is happening from my research is that a harbor wall is being created at the lower of the 2 heights as the higher wall gets closer to the edge. And so this smooths out the visual effect of the wall transferring down to the lower level since it's such a steep drop. And so the higher wall continues until it hits the edge, then disappears. And the lower wall continues from that point onward. And so the lower walls actually spawn a little bit in front of the higher wall, but that stuff's in the document. You can look at that if you'd like. It's not particularly useful for this situation. The other thing that's kind of interesting is if you do this again, and I stop it here, what actually happens is both walls are created, and then it says, wow, okay, you stopped it. And the higher wall falls to the second wall's position, and then the second wall backtracks to where the first wall was, and it has the lower, and therefore has like the lower distance, even though you would think it would be on this higher aspect. So that's just an interesting fact about harbor wall. One more thing about this falling mechanic is if you spawn the wall a lot closer, the wall will actually exist for a short amount of time in 2 positions before doing that. Not sure what the reason for that is, but it's an interesting observation. So now that we kind of have an understanding of all the mechanics, we can go down to the specific scenarios. There is one more thing, actually. Okay, so if a wall is traveling out of bounds, it just maintains its height. So if I were to do this, it just maintains its height. That is important for future reference. Same thing if it were to go up this ramp, and then I were to follow this, it maintains its height after it's gone off into the out of bounds area. So now we can start to analyze this position here. So there's 2 important factors when looking at this position. Where the wall starts and how the wall travels out of bounds. And so we actually have to do some analysis of this area here, because this area here is very interesting. So you might expect this area here to be a floor and a valid surface for harbor wall to transfer over. It is not. Harbor wall does not interact with this terrain at all, and it doesn't interact with this terrain either. So if I throw an orb through here, it actually goes through the ceiling and falls onto this floor. This is also down here not a valid harbor wall terrain. And I can show you that by approximating the height of it here and showing you that it does not clip onto the surface even though it's well within 1 meter of that. And so the second thing that I did was look in here. So I can stand here, and what you can see if I move back and forth is I can't get all the way to this right side. And the reason for that is because there's an invisible triangle. It's approximate a triangle where I'm running into that. So if I crouch, I can actually get under it a little bit more, and I can go a little farther that direction. And so the triangle kind of stops in about this position. So maybe a third to a half of the way through this area. And so that's important because this invisible section is valid terrain. It's kind of hard to show, but if you can see that it actually exploded off that invisible piece. And so not only that, but the harbor wall can also interact with it. And so when the harbor wall travels from back further, it gets time to jump onto this terrain here, elevate its height about this distance, and that extra height while traveling out of bounds gets it enough height to clip up to this area. And so if you were to spawn it in front of the piece of invisible terrain, such as this, get a short wall because it did not interact with that piece of invisible terrain to get it higher. But if you were to do it from back here, it has plenty of time to interact with the invisible terrain, and therefore it has enough height to where it gets to here, it clips up, and you get that extra height on that wall. Now, if you wanted a lineup to be able to get as close to the point as possible, right about here on this blob, this will get you a high wall still, and then if you go a little bit farther to the right, should get a short wall. So this blob, my other point I usually use is here, just slightly to the right, and I'm going to throw this wall. This should give me a short wall. I did not line that up correctly. So if I'm going to line it up correctly, let's make sure that was correct. Yeah, there it is. There's the short wall. And so basically what's happening is if you spawn it before or on top of this invisible wall, it will get that extra height, which will let it jump up to that terrain later. And so the breaking point for that is somewhere in between this dot and this blob, but it's pretty precise. So let's say it's about here. On the map, you can see it's well beyond the end of this tunnel, but it's still able to jump up if I go a little farther back. So well beyond the end of the tunnel, but it got spawned on the invisible wall, so it gets that extra height. And so that's why this specific scenario works the way it does. Now, on to the difficult thing on predicting harbor walls is if I go to this example I showed earlier, and throw that again, you would expect this segment of the wall to go up as well. The tricky thing is, this is actually higher than a meter. So this is not the thing that's boosting the wall. What's actually boosting the wall, from my understanding, is there's these pieces here where it's at the base of this container. Very hard to see. Bear with me. There's these pieces here, very, very difficult to see, that are slightly above the ground. See there. And what's happening is it's clipping onto that and then immediately clipping onto here. It's getting that extra boost in height. But in between these two crates, there's not the same valid terrain. So it doesn't actually, the center point being in between those two crates makes it so it doesn't jump up. All right, now we're in this scenario. And basically how you're going to analyze this scenario is this is about 4 meters tall. So if you're in the upper 2 meters, then you're going to be able to spawn the wall up there, like that, and it spawns on top of this. If you're in the lower 2 meters, 1 meter up, you're going to spawn the wall, and it's going to spawn inside here, because there's no valid spawning terrain. And so it really depends on where on the rope he was at the time and how he casted it. Like that would cast on the surface. If you were lower on the rope, that would cast below. And so that's kind of the dependency on how that specific situation works. A couple more things I wanted to mention before going is the usefulness / utility of this wall. For example, if you wanted to get some extra height on this wall so that someone wouldn't be able to look over the wall and spray you from this box, into main, then you would be able to do something like create a lineup from back here, maybe even like here, and throw a wall, and it would give that extra height. I don't have a lineup for that, but that is a possibility of something you could do with the wall. Another way you could use the wall is this. So far, everything I found is quite niche because you need some drastic differences in height. But you could do something like this, where if you stop it out there, what it'll do is, because the center point's here and then the next center point's way down here, it'll make this kind of a one-way, and so you can spray people that are coming through this alleyway. Not super useful, especially because it cuts off a lot of sightlines of possible threats they could be encountering on their way out of main. But it is something that's interesting enough to where I could see the cheese strategy, let's say, working out with that. Another thing to mention is this example here is actually perfect. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but something you can do is, since this wall is spawned out of bounds, normally it does get the short wall when you're at this distance. Short wall, there we go. But if you were to abuse this fact that you know how it spawns out of bounds and jump and then throw it, you can get the tall wall because you get that extra distance. And so now you have a tall wall, even though, let's say you didn't have this space way back here. Because the extra height on the out of bounds, let's put back up there again. So there's quite a few possibilities with this wall, how useful this information could be. A lot of it's pretty niche, but hopefully this helps, and I appreciate anybody's time who was willing to watch this quite windy analysis of Harbor Wall.